Two global icons, a private mansion, one script that should never have been read. When the cameras stopped rolling, one celebrity vanished without a trace on live film. Hours later, the other was found dead, with a razor and a reel of unedited footage beside him. But this isn't just a murder, it's a performance, and someone is still writing the final scene. Underscore, what if fame was a lie, scripted by someone who was never meant to be seen? Welcome to the case that was erased before it ever began. She never got her applause. Chapter 1. Invitation to silence. The snow had fallen that morning with the kind of indifference only mountains understood. Thick, deliberate, and mute, each flake a silent hush over the blackened treetops lining the long ascent to Fairglen. It was a mansion born of ambition and sealed by mystery, perched above the Swiss Valley, like a theatre waiting for its final act. No locals lived that high, no tourists climbed it, and no one ever left with stories they were willing to tell. Miss Jane Marple, modest in stature, quiet in voice, yet unshakably precise in her observations, arrived precisely at 3:12 p.m, as instructed in the letter. A driver had met her at the train station in Geneva, said nothing, and opened the rear door to a dark vehicle that smelled faintly of burnt wood and bergamot. No questions were asked. Not a single word was spoken on the winding journey up the snow-drenched road, and she did not press for conversation. She had, after all, been summoned. The envelope that found its way to her small cottage in St. Mary Mead bore no return address, no sender's name, only a black seal and the initials JVD pressed into wax like the last breath of something once elegant. Inside, a single sheet of stationery, crisp and exact, with a hand that wrote like it had been trained to conceal something. Your presence is requested at Fairglen House for a private weekend engagement. You will be treated with respect. You will not be photographed. You will be compensated. The matter regards an artistic project of psychological interest. Attendance is symbolic. Signed, Julian Dane. Julian Dane. And there, the first crack in the silence. A man whose films once shattered attendance records, whispered about in Cannes, worshipped in Berlin, and boycotted in Prague, for reasons no one quite agreed on. A mind behind the camera, who had not appeared in public in over 8 years, and his sister, Vera Dane, the face of global pop mystique, whose voice seduced charts and fashion houses alike. Her recent withdrawal from the public eye had left tabloids feral with speculation, reclusive illness, cosmetic disaster, cult involvement, secret pregnancy, and most recently, death. Miss Marple, for all her affection toward the quietude of her English village, had never dismissed curiosity when dressed in sincerity. Something about the phrasing of the letter, its restraint, its cold civility, had gnawed at her. Not an invitation, not really, a summons perhaps, but for what? The gates to Fairglen were black iron, shaped like unraveling film reels, and opened before them, without the driver touching a thing. The gravel crunched beneath them as the car climbed the final bend. The mansion emerged from the mist like a palace that had forgotten its own name. Tall windows shuttered, wings stretching out into white emptiness, and a central tower that looked more observant than inhabited. A butler, unnamed, greeted her with a bow that belonged to a different century and guided her into a vestibule lined with coats that didn't look recently worn. He took her gloves with silent efficiency, offered no introduction, and disappeared into a corridor veiled by velvet. She was alone. Miss Marple took the moment to study her surroundings. The walls were ivory but aged, as though they'd been repainted often, but without love. A mirror faced the door, long, silver-edged and curious. It reflected her just as she was, but she noticed something odd in the frame's corner. A smudge. No, not quite a smudge. A fingerprint, just one, larger than hers, pressed hard as if someone had leaned close to see themselves, then changed their mind. At precisely 3:21, a door creaked open behind her. She turned. Julian Dane had not aged poorly. Rather, he had aged precisely, as though every wrinkle, every strand of grey at his temple, had been placed by design. His frame was leaner than she remembered from the few photographs she had seen, and his eyes, those deep, pale irises that critics once called silver knives, were not dull, not at all, but they were tired. "Miss Marple," he said, without smiling. "Thank you for coming." She nodded gently. "You were rather insistent." He did not flinch. "Yes." There was silence again, long enough to be mistaken for awkwardness. Then he turned and motioned her to follow. "She'll be glad you're here." Vera. So she was here. He led her through a series of rooms that bled into each other with aristocratic ease, drawing rooms lined with film posters, most of them framed in gold, but covered slightly by sheer drapes, as if they embarrassed the current occupants. A library with no books, only scripts, stacked, bound, and sealed with numbers, and a hallway of black and white portraits that bore the same two faces over and over again, Julian and Vera, but in different poses, different moods, and sometimes with a third figure, always turned away from the camera. They passed no one. She heard no footsteps, no servants, only the low hum of something electrical behind the walls. Eventually, they stopped at a study. He did not open the door. Instead, he turned to her and said, "This is where we'll begin, tonight." "Begin what?" He looked at her for a long time. The end scene. The phrase lingered in the air like a password. She felt it settle around her, not ominous, but curated. "And what part?" she asked softly. "Do you expect me to play?" "You're not here to play," Julian said. "You're here to observe." Another pause. Then he added, "You'll understand more after the rehearsal." It was the way he said it, after, that caught her ear. Not during, not if. He opened the study door and let her pass. It was modest. A fire burned gently in the grate. A decanter of brandy sat untouched on the sideboard. A single chair faced a projection screen. On the desk, a reel labeled in block letters, "The Murder of Two Prime Celebrity. Code V." She glanced at it. Julian did not explain. Instead, he said, "Your room is ready. A maid will escort you. The rehearsal is at dusk." Miss Marple nodded, absorbing all of it. The distance in his tone, the precision of his words, the fact that he had not asked if she wanted to stay, but something inside her whispered, "Stay." She turned to him one last time. "Mr. Dane, you said my presence was symbolic. May I ask, of what?" He looked at her with the kind of gaze only people with too many secrets ever perfect. Then simply, closure. And with that, he closed the door behind her. Miss Marple was shown to her quarters by a maid who never spoke, only gestured, once toward the window which had been taped shut from the outside, once toward the bathroom where the mirror had been covered by a sheet, and once to the wardrobe where only grey clothing hung, as if white and black were too decisive for this house. The note left on her pillow read, "Please wear the grey, all others have." She did not touch it. Instead, she sat at the small desk, opened her notebook, and wrote just 3 things. 1. There are no staff names. 2. Vera is present, but unseen. 3. What does code V stand for? She paused, staring at the page. Then she added, "They asked for me, but they never told me why." Outside, dusk crept in. Not golden, not blue, just grey. Everything at Fairglen was painted in shadows that refused to explain themselves, and in the walls faintly, like a whisper curling through old film reels, a song began to play. It was Vera's voice, but it wasn't coming from any speaker. It was coming from behind the mirror, and somewhere in the house, someone began to clap, just once, then stopped. The silence that followed wasn't empty. Chapter 2. The rehearsal. That wasn't. The snow had stopped falling by evening, but the sky above Fairglen had not cleared. Instead, it had turned to a fogged velvet, neither light nor dark, just a smothering grey that made time feel like something caught between scenes. Dusk did not arrive. It settled, slowly, without edges, as though the sun had lost interest in finishing the day. Inside the mansion, a low warmth pulsed from the radiators, though none of the guests could remember hearing them click on. The fire crackled gently in the drawing room, but the logs were dry, untouched. Servants moved like ghosts, always at the edge of vision, always just around the corner. No doors creaked, yet they always seemed to open on cue. There was an air of perfection in how nothing drew attention, and it was this very perfection that unnerved Miss Marple. She had dressed in her own clothes, not the grey ones requested, her brooch pinned with gentle defiance, her shoes scuffed from the London station, her gloves folded neatly in her coat pocket as she made her way down the long corridor toward what Julian had called the rehearsal. He had not appeared again since their earlier conversation, and no one had fetched her, yet she knew where to go. The path had simply become apparent, not marked, not lit, but evident, the way things do when someone else has planned them long before you arrive. The theatre room was located in the East Wing, a former ballroom now retrofitted with cameras, lights, and sound panels padded into the walls like the interior of an expensive coffin. The chandelier still hung, though most of its crystals were missing. Below it, a makeshift stage had been built. Black floor, white backdrop, no props, no setting, just space. Vera was already standing on it. She was dressed not as the public knew her. No glittering gown, no sculpted curls, no dramatic shadow in her eyes. She was barefoot, pale, and clothed in what looked like a rehearsal slip, barely more than a nightdress, loose and tired. Her hair was pinned up messily, revealing the long line of her neck. A microphone hung from the ceiling, just inches above her lips. She did not look toward Miss Marple, nor did she acknowledge the handful of other guests now seated in the velvet chairs that had been positioned before the stage, some of them familiar from photos, others not. An art critic from Vienna, a television presenter from Rome, a silent woman in gloves whom no one seemed to recognize. They sat like invited shadows. Julian stood off to the side, beside a camera rig. He wore headphones, but the cord wasn't attached to anything. He raised his hand. Begin. No lights changed. No cue music started. The room remained still. Then Vera opened her mouth and sang. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't a concert. It was quieter. A lullaby, perhaps. A tune without rhythm. A melody without accompaniment. She sang as though she were the only person in the room. No affectation, no reach for applause. Her voice was softer than her recordings, and somehow, it sounded older, like she had learned to sing beneath her breath. Miss Marple did not recognize the song, nor, it seemed, did anyone else. But there was something else, something not quite right. The room felt out of sync. There was a delay between her lips and the sound, not by much. A second maybe, but noticeable. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, narrowing her eyes. The microphone swayed slightly in the air above Vera, too much for a room with no wind. And then she saw it, in the mirror. One large full-length mirror had been placed at the back of the stage, its purpose unclear, perhaps for blocking, perhaps for artistic choice. Vera's reflection wasn't singing. It stood still, not frozen, but still, and then it began singing, just one note behind her. Miss Marple did not move, nor did she speak. She simply watched. The reflection mouthed the words, just a breath too late, and then on the fourth line of the song, Vera was gone, not fainted, not collapsed, not rushed away, gone. She had been there, singing. Then she wasn't. A sharp breath gasped from the audience. One woman stood. Julian didn't move. The camera rolled. The microphone still swung slightly. The reflection remained. Still singing, still there. One final note echoed across the stage, and only the reflection's mouth moved. Then that, too, stopped. No one clapped. Julian lowered his hand. "Cut," he said. Flat. Hollow. The camera stopped recording. No one moved for a long moment. Then, with the calm of someone washing a dish, Julian removed the camera reel, placed it in a marked canister, and walked out the side door without a word. Miss Marple stood, quietly, unhurried. She walked to the stage. There were no trap doors, no wires, no projection screens. The mirror was just a mirror now. Her own reflection met her calmly. She turned to the rest of the room. The woman in gloves had fainted. The critic whispered something in German that sounded like a prayer. The television presenter had begun quietly filming on her phone, but the screen was black. Miss Marple stepped off the stage and followed the corridor where Julian had gone. No one stopped her. She found him in the editing suite, formerly the library. The shelves were gone. The curtains were drawn. A long table was lined with analog monitors. The reel he had just recorded was already playing on screen. She watched. It was exactly as she remembered. Vera, singing, then gone. Except, this time the mirror showed nothing. No reflection, just emptiness. "Did you edit this?" she asked softly. "No," Julian replied. "This is raw." She walked to the tape box and examined the label. It read, "Take 4, code, reflection." She looked at him. How many takes were there? Only one. Then why label it 4? He looked at her then, truly looked, and for a moment, he seemed afraid. Because it was the 4th time she's vanished. Miss Marple said nothing. She returned to her room. The hallways were even quieter now. The light in the corridor flickered not because of the bulbs, but because something seemed to interfere with the space itself, as though movement could be reversed at will. She found her door slightly ajar. Inside, the room was as she'd left it, except the mirror above the sink was no longer covered, and in its reflection, she saw Vera, not standing, not moving, but seated on the bed behind her. When she turned, no one was there. She approached the mirror, watching. Vera sat perfectly still. In her lap was a book, a diary. Miss Marple leaned closer. The words on the page were visible for only a moment. "It's happening again. We never buried it right." The mirror went black. Miss Marple stepped back, calmly, sat down, took out her notebook. She wrote one new line. "This is not the first performance, but it may be the last." Then she walked to her door and opened it. There was a screen mounted to the hallway wall now, where there hadn't been one before. Footage played, silent security footage, but it wasn't on loop, it was on rewind. Vera, walking backward, Julian, leaving a room he hadn't yet entered. Guests, unsmiling yet repeating movements they hadn't made, and above the reel, in white letters, Scene 2. The incident. Miss Marple tilted her head. Slowly, someone was tampering with time, and the rehearsal was not a rehearsal at all. It was playback, but of what, and who had written it? Chapter 3. Someone's role is missing. The fog that descended the morning after Vera's vanishing, this was a fog that pressed, heavy and sentient, wrapping the entirety of Fairglen House in a kind of suspended opacity, neither light nor dark, but rather a strange pause in perception itself. There was no sun, no clear sense of morning, just dimness, and a mansion that no longer looked like something real, but rather like a set half dismantled, waiting for actors who had missed their cue. Miss Marple stood by the window of her guest room. The frost on the glass hadn't melted, and yet there were no signs of cold. The patterns in the ice looked almost deliberate, curves, crescents, shapes that mirrored the strange symbols she had seen printed on the film reels downstairs. Patterns that might have meant nothing to someone else, but to her, hinted at a language spoken not aloud, but beneath the surface of everything around her. The mansion was no longer quiet. It was hushed. The kind of hush that follows a line forgotten on stage, a hesitation, drawn out long enough for someone to forget where they were supposed to stand, and someone was missing. Vera, still missing. Julian had issued no statement, no apology, no suggestion of emergency, just silence. The guests, once curious, had begun to drift like chess pieces across a board that no longer obeyed the usual logic of the game. They stayed close to the main halls, speaking in low tones, always looking over their shoulders. Something had changed, not with a sound or announcement, but in the way everyone began to behave. The lead producer, a tall man with ivory cufflinks and the voice of someone used to being obeyed, had stopped speaking entirely, not just to Miss Marple, but to everyone. He sat in one of the south parlour chairs for hours, a teacup balanced in his hand, his eyes fixed on the wall-mounted screen that no longer responded to remote input. The footage displayed there looped gently, a still image of Vera, holding a microphone, smiling faintly. Nothing moved. Yet the footage never repeated exactly the same way. Each time her mouth closed, her eyes opened wider. Miss Marple took notes. The editor was next to unravel, a young woman, late 20s perhaps, whose lipstick always looked freshly applied, but never quite the same colour. Twice, approached Miss Marple, late that afternoon. Not with confidence, not with caution, but with a kind of desperation that lives in the space between belief and fear. "They've changed the script," she whispered. Miss Marple's reply was soft. "Who?" "I don't know," the girl breathed. "It's not in the system. It's not even backed up. The master document, blank, just blank. But the footage keeps aligning with the new version, scenes that weren't supposed to happen, angles we didn't plan for." "And Vera?" Miss Marple asked. "She didn't disappear," the editor said. "She followed it, whatever it is." Later that night, Julian locked himself inside the editing suite. No one saw him enter, but when the door was tried, it was sealed. Lights flickered behind the frosted window. The screen displayed something indecipherable, a flurry of white and grey static shaped like faces. If one stared long enough, someone claimed to hear him talking to someone who wasn't there. Whispers, punctuated by the scratching sound of a razor against celluloid, and a sentence heard by the housekeeper, who had begun sleeping in the pantry out of anxiety. "We filmed this before," Julian muttered. "But I cut it." It was never clear if he meant the footage or the event. By dawn, another guest was gone. The journalist, an investigative reporter from Paris, known for her exposés on corporate crime, who had arrived under the name C. Dumas. She had been seated at breakfast, then she wasn't. Her room was untouched, save for the television, which played nothing but static on a muted loop, and a note on the nightstand. Written in red ink, each letter perfectly spaced. "Check scene 17. The code is in the applause." Miss Marple read it twice. She didn't pocket the note, she didn't photograph it. She simply memorized it, then burned it in the fireplace. There was no scene 17 in the master script, but she had found references to it, buried in odd places. A scrap of paper tucked into the pocket of Vera's abandoned dressing robe, containing only the phrase, "Don't trust the third line." A menu in the dining hall, dated with a day that had not yet occurred. And a list of character names in the props room, with one scratched out violently, as though someone had tried to erase not just the name, but the memory of it. Miss Marple requested access to the archives. She expected to be refused, but the maid, now more shadow than servant, simply handed her a key. It was cold, older than the rest of the keys in the house, and it did not match any of the labeled doors. But she tried it on the door at the end of the west corridor, the one that had always remained just slightly ajar, as if inviting, but warning. It fit. The room was not an archive, not in the traditional sense. It was a gallery of absence, walls lined with scripts that had no titles, reels with no labels, photographs of events that had never occurred, at least not publicly, all staged, all rehearsed, faces blurred, names omitted. Scenes set in rooms that did not exist in Fairglen, but somehow did now. There was no dust. Someone had been here recently. On a table at the center sat a single page. Typed. Precise. Scene 17. Interior. The audience room sound. Applause distorted. Increasing. Lights flicker. One seat is empty. Reflection claps alone. End scene. Miss Marple read the lines, not once but 4 times. The applause. The empty seat. The reflection. Each word layered with something just beneath its literal meaning, like script directions meant not for performance, but for manipulation. She stepped back. The mirror behind her was not there moments ago. Her reflection did not mimic her movement. It blinked first, then smiled. But she had not, and then it matched her again. The door creaked open behind her. No one was there, but the hallway lights, once stable, now flickered in patterns, one long, 2 short. A pause, then the same again. It was code. She wrote it down. She would decipher it later. Back in her room, her notebook had been moved, only slightly, but enough, and someone had underlined one line she had written the previous night. "We never buried it right." She had not written that line herself, someone else had. But behind the scenes, something darker was lurking, and it was using the script to speak. There was one role missing, and someone intended for her to play it. Chapter 4. The Director's Confession. The fog lifted just enough to let the truth catch its breath. By the 4th morning, at Fairglen House, The silence had taken on a different flavor. No longer an absence of noise. It had become the presence of something listening. Hallways had grown quieter, not because fewer people walked them, but because the house itself now seemed to respond only to observation. A footstep, made in certainty, echoed clearly. One made in hesitation did not echo at all. The doors opened only when looked at directly, and the mirrors, those elegant, unblinking frames, had begun to reflect not what stood before them, but what had once stood there before. Miss Marple noticed this shift, not as a sudden event, but in the rhythm of small things. A fork, left slightly turned, on the breakfast tray, always pointing east. The fact that the pianist, who had not spoken a word, now played only unfinished pieces, and the way the housekeeper had stopped referring to Mr. Dane and started using only his first name, as if the formal title had been dismissed. Julian Dane had not been seen in 2 days. After Vera's disappearance, his presence had retreated from host to observer, and then from observer to shadow. But on the morning of the 4th day, something different occurred. At precisely 9:47 a.m., a scream was heard, not loud, not theatrical, but sharp and brief, like a single line cut from a performance just before it finished. It came from the West Wing, near the editing suite, and was followed by nothing at all. Miss Marple was already halfway there. She did not run, she never ran. Instead, she moved with that deliberate calm that seemed to carry the weight of observation itself, a pace that demanded the world hold still, long enough to be understood. When she arrived, the door was open, not just unlocked, but wide open, an invitation, or perhaps a resignation. Inside the room, the equipment had been powered down, the screens were dark, the overhead lights flickered faintly, but did not buzz, and there, slumped in the low velvet chair, beneath the wall of reels, was Julian Dane. Not unconscious, not entirely present, either. His head was tilted sideways, resting on the edge of the armrest, his fingers twitching, in a slow rhythm, as if still editing something in the air. His eyes were open, but not focused, and his mouth moved with the ghost of a sentence that did not want to be spoken. Miss Marple approached. He saw her, but did not startle. "They told me to rewrite her," he murmured. "I tried." There was no one else in the room. Miss Marple sat beside him. "Who is they?" she asked, her voice almost kind. He didn't answer that. He simply repeated, softer this time, "I tried." Then his eyes closed, not in sleep, but in something colder, something exhausted, and he did not speak again. A maid arrived minutes later, not surprised, not frantic, simply waiting. Miss Marple gestured to the door. "Lock it," she said. The girl obeyed. Miss Marple turned to the wall of reels. There were hundreds, thousands perhaps. Some labelled, some not, but one small case, silver, dulled with age, marked not in ink, but engraved, rested at eye level. She reached for it. It was heavier than the others. Its face read, "The Third Star, 1995, private, cut, no scene number, no slate, no label." She placed the reel on the player and pressed the manual crank to feed it. The film began without sound. Black and white, grainy. A stage appeared. Younger versions of Julian and Vera, no older than 11 perhaps, stood beneath a velvet curtain, dressed in costumes that looked handmade. Julian in a mock tuxedo, Vera in a gown made of curtain fabric and imagination. They were acting. That much was clear. A school production. No, too elaborate. This was not public performance. This was rehearsal, but not for something to be shared. It was private. Staged, filmed intentionally. A child's voice from behind the camera instructed them. "Scene 1. Take 1. Julian bowed. Vera curtsied. They recited lines. Familiar lines. Lines that had appeared, almost word for word, in the first rehearsal, just days ago. Miss Marple sat back. The script they had been following now. It wasn't new. It had been written decades before. But that wasn't the revelation. It came next. A girl stepped into frame, blonde, slightly shorter than Vera. She smiled. Too long, too wide. She said nothing, but she was in every frame that followed, always in the background, always watching, always smiling, never speaking. No title card listed her name, no stage direction acknowledged her, but she was there, present, vital. In one scene, Julian turned to speak to her, his mouth moving, but the audio lost. In another, Vera handed her a script. The girl nodded, then handed it back. Her fingers lingered on the last page, and then in the final recorded frame, the girl turned to the camera, stepped forward, and blinked. The screen went black, but the reel hadn't finished spinning. Miss Marple advanced it manually. It returned to the stage, present day. Color, sharp focus. Vera, again. In the same slip dress from the rehearsal, standing, alone, looking straight into the lens, she whispered, almost too soft to hear. "She knows we lied," and the film snapped. Miss Marple rewound the reel, but the final frame was gone, replaced with static. She sat in the quiet. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Who was the third star, and why had she been erased? Chapter 5. Playback error. The house had started watching, not overtly, not through motion sensors or blinking red lights. No, Fairglen House had no need for such crude devices. Instead, it observed the way old mirrors do, silently, patiently, and only when your back was turned. It remembered footsteps, echoed laughter in rooms that hadn't hosted it for decades, and rewound conversations that had never been spoken aloud. By the fifth day, Miss Marple no longer marked time by breakfast or the chiming of the dining room clock. Meals arrived, but no one saw who delivered them. The sky outside remained an indecisive grey, as though caught between scene changes, and the internal clocks of every guest seemed to stutter in sync with the footage. Because now, the footage would not stop. It began quietly, just one screen in the projection room. Then, another in the west corridor. Then a third, inexplicably glowing within an unplugged set beside the foyer mirror. The same reel, each time. Vera, alone, singing, disappearing. Again, and again, and again. Except each playback was subtly different. On the first loop, her hands moved mid-note, trembling, unsure. On the second, her mouth formed a different word, though the sound remained unchanged. On the third, she glanced to the left, toward something. No one else could see it. Miss Marple sat before the screen as others passed by, a few pretending not to look, others watching with increasing dread. But she noticed what the others did not. The footage wasn't just looping, it was adapting, reacting. The more it was watched, the more it revealed. As though it had been filmed in layers, each pass peeling back another line of performance. And somewhere, deep within the static between frames, something, someone, was waiting. Later that day, a guest from Berlin approached her. A fashion consultant, sharp in silhouette, but now blurred in thought. He hadn't slept. "I had a dream," he said. "I was in a theatre, no audience, just empty seats, and someone called my name. When I turned to look, I was on the stage, applauding myself, and I woke up clapping." Miss Marple said nothing. He lifted his hand. His palms were raw. He hadn't been dreaming. He had been applauding for hours. Others confessed similar nightmares, if they could be called that. Dreams where they were being filmed, always filmed, yet never remembered. Dreams where scripts arrived by post, containing dialogue they hadn't yet spoken, but would. Dreams in which applause came from behind them, and when they turned to face it, no one was there, just mirrors. By dusk, one of the mansion's televisions shattered, not from a blow, but from within. A crack spread outward, in the shape of a smile, wide, quiet. Miss Marple returned to her room. Her notebook was no longer where she left it, not hidden, not gone. Simply changed. The pages were intact, the ink was hers, the handwriting matched, but the words had shifted. Notes she remembered writing: check vault door, mirror glitch, same time as static. Vera's eyes, track left only in reel 4, were no longer arranged as observations. They were stage directions. Enter hallway, with measured pause. Inspect mirror, left corner, tilt head slightly, return to writing desk. Begin realizing, and the final line, exit scene. Do not question. Her hand trembled only once. Then, she closed the book. The silence wasn't empty. It was watching, and it had begun to write her. She made her way to Julian's office, or what had once been his office. The lock had been replaced, not physically, but conceptually. Doors that once opened with keys now required intention, and the ones that once invited passage now paused at the threshold, resisting presence. But she passed through. Julian was gone. The room was warm, untouched. His coat remained on the back of the chair. His ashtray, filled with matchsticks, was still scented. But the man himself vanished. No note, no warning, only the faintest trace of burnt celluloid in the air. Miss Marple turned to leave. She nearly missed it. On the mirror, above the fireplace, 3 lipstick marks, not 2. The first faint, dry, likely Vera's years ago. The second fresher, perhaps the assistant. The third, wet, recent, uneven, smudged, as if done in a rush, or by someone whose hands didn't belong to them. And when Miss Marple moved closer, her own reflection did not. It stood still, waiting. Then smiled, only once, then matched her again. She turned. Behind her, nothing. She remained in the room until the sun would have set, if time outside had bothered to progress. The clocks had frozen at 6:41 p.m. The seconds hand twitched, but never advanced. The guests began whispering again, this time about the assistant. Julian's personal aide, young, smart, devoted. She had been seen entering the wardrobe wing earlier that day. No one had seen her exit. Her room was entered. Everything was untouched. Everything, except the floor-length mirror across from the bed. It was clean, too clean, wiped free of dust in the shape of a body once seated in front of it, and written, in reverse, "Applaud her." She remembered. No one could explain it. No one would. Miss Marple left the room last. She paused only once, to look in the mirror, and whisper, "Who gave you the script?" The reflection blinked, but she had not. The playback had become performance. And the performance had become prophecy. One role was still unclaimed, and the house had begun to rehearse her. Chapter 6. Act the 3rd. The Forgotten Sister. The house had not changed, yet everything inside it felt rearranged, not in the manner of shifting furniture or changing locks, but in the deeper, slower movement of something repurposing itself from within, like a theatre set being dismantled behind the curtains, even as the actors continued their lines. And as Miss Marple walked the long corridor past the gallery of silent portraits, each brushstroke on the walls seemed to regard her with a new weight, as though some invisible set of eyes had refocused, not merely to observe, but to assess. The air carried a faint trace of sandalwood and ash, the kind of scent that lingers after old documents have been disturbed, and it was this very scent that led her, not by invitation, but by deduction, into the eastern annex, where the storage vaults lay hidden behind 3 locked doors and a forgotten velvet drape, the colour of dried wine. There had been no mention of the annex in the house's blueprints, and yet it existed, undeniably so, tucked behind the old rehearsal chamber, lined with faded scorebooks, defunct typewriters, and an entire wall of filing cabinets, labelled with names that had been deliberately struck through in thick, red pencil. She passed rows of disused clapperboards, their wood chipped from excessive use, and costume sketches of characters never seen on stage or screen. One labelled Vera Draft, with a second figure sketched beside her. No name, no costume notes, only eyes penciled too large, and a smile drawn faintly, almost timidly, at the corner of her lips. Miss Marple moved slowly, respectfully, not for fear of the room, but because the silence here felt earned, as though breaking it without cause would awaken something that had taken great effort to forget. It was in the 5th cabinet, marked Dane Early Projects, a Coval use only, that she found the file. It was thin, unassuming, and bound in faded black cord that had been looped, then tied, then looped again. not to preserve the contents, but to keep them hidden from casual curiosity. The top corner was marked with a code, ESACT01, and below it, a title written in narrow formal script, The Forgotten Sister. Inside, photos, newspaper clippings, rehearsal notes, and a partially burnt casting list, 3 names once typed, now only 2 visible, Julian Dane, Vera Dane, and beneath them, the faint charred remains of a third line, the letters E and L, just barely intact, as if scorched into silence by someone who had not wanted the name to remain. She read slowly. The file detailed a production from the early 1990s, never released, never aired, never even listed among the family's known projects. A children's drama, it claimed, set in a seaside village, starring the siblings, all 3 of them, Julian, Vera, and Eloise. There it was. Her name, Eloise Dane, 14, at the time of production. Never credited, never mentioned, no press releases, no photos, no records beyond this file. Only a single paragraph stood out, typed and corrected in several different inks. Eloise struggled with scene 6. She knew the lines better than anyone, often finishing the others before they could say them, but refused to follow blocking, often wandered stage left, murmuring endings before the middle had even begun. Emotionally disconnected, rehearsed alone, claimed the others stole the spotlight before her part was ever written, and then, scribbled below it in pen, smaller, jagged, she knew all our lines before we did. We cut her from the final scene. Miss Marple closed the file and held it in her lap. The temperature in the room hadn't changed, and yet it felt as if the walls had drawn nearer. On the floor, half buried beneath an empty script box, lay a cracked phonograph player, the kind once used to cue music during intermission or record voice notes from behind the stage curtain. Dust coated its edge, but the needle had been recently moved. She turned the handle. It clicked softly, then played. The sound that emerged was distorted, warbled by time, but unmistakably melodic, a lullaby, fractured, repeating the same 4 lines in a voice almost too delicate to pin down as either child or woman. 3 girls danced. 1 girl fell. The audience clapped. She never got up. Again and again, the voice faltered slightly, on never, then faded out completely, as though reluctant to finish the line. A 4th time. Miss Marple stood perfectly still. There was no record on the machine, just the needle, moving on its own. The mirror behind her, which she had not noticed upon entering, now reflected 3 chairs arranged neatly along the opposite wall. Only 2 existed in the room. The 3rd remained in the mirror, and in that chair sat a girl in shadow, her feet swinging gently, a ribbon in her hair, her gaze fixed not on Miss Marple, but on the phonograph. When Miss Marple turned to look, there was nothing, but when she turned back, the ribbon remained, tied neatly to the armrest of the non-existent chair, not fabric, but ink, drawn onto the glass. It was not fear that gripped her, not entirely. It was something else closer to realization, like hearing a melody you knew as a child, and suddenly remembering you never learned who wrote it. She walked to the phonograph, turned it off, and took the file with her, not out of possession, but protection. The past, she knew, could not be destroyed, only misplaced, and misplaced things, when they return, do not always come back kindly. As she stepped back into the hallway, the corridor lights blinked once, long, then short, then long again. The pattern repeated. It was Morse code, ELO. The rest faded before it could finish. The walls here whispered now, not in language, but through repetition. A low hum from the television in the sitting room echoed a line that no one had spoken aloud. She knows we lied. And on the grand piano in the ballroom, a music sheet had appeared. 1 line only, written in treble clef. Finale. The 3rd voice. Vera was not the youngest. Julian was not the most gifted, and neither had written the original ending. It had been Eloise, watching, mimicking, predicting, until they wrote her out of her own story, and the story was trying to write her back in. Chapter 7. Locked in Scene 17. It had become increasingly difficult to determine which parts of Fairglen House had been built with brick and intention, and which had simply materialized, grown perhaps, in the way ivy grows, silently, insistently, without seeking permission. Because the longer Miss Marple remained inside the estate, the more she began to sense that certain hallways had not always been there, or, if they had not always led to the same place, nor welcomed the same kind of footstep, and that somewhere within the silent architecture of forgotten rehearsal rooms and locked editing bays, there was a logic, not architectural, but narrative, not spatial, but scripted, and it was that sense, that the house followed its own form of direction, that led her to scene 17. Not by map, not by memory, but by recognition. She had awoken that morning to find her lamp turned on, though she had not touched it. Her notebook remained closed, untouched on the desk, yet a pencil, which she distinctly remembered placing inside the drawer, now rested gently across the cover, forming an arrow that pointed not outward, but inward, as if inviting her to open the very pages she had tried to leave alone. And when she did, she found no new writing, no strange rearrangement, only one line beneath her last note, written in a thin, elegant hand that was not her own. "You're close now. Listen to the walls." She folded the notebook and stood. The hall beyond her door was unusually silent, not in the hush of absence, but the hush of anticipation, the kind one hears in the moments before an overture begins, when the conductor has yet to raise the baton, but the theatre is already breathless with what's to come. She moved slowly, down a corridor that once led to the conservatory, but no longer did. Instead, it narrowed slightly, the lighting dimming with each step, until the air itself took on the velvet hush of theatre curtains, and the sconces began to flicker in a rhythm too slow to be electric. There was a door ahead, not locked, not even closed, painted red, not freshly, but recently, as if its color had been restored by someone who remembered it too well. It bore no number, but as she reached for the handle, the lights behind her blinked once, and the phonograph that should not have worked began to play a faint echo of a line she had heard before, warped and drawn out, like a voice on aging film. 3 girls danced. She pushed the door open. What lay beyond was not a room, it was a corridor, longer than the house should allow, lined on either side by framed production stills, not photographs of real events, but stills captured from scenes that had never aired, each labeled, not with a title, but with a code: C17A, C17B, C17C. The characters within the images were familiar, and not Vera, Julian, and a girl whose face had always been turned slightly, just enough to hide her identity, yet never so much that she felt absent. In every frame, she stood between them. In every frame, she smiled. At the far end, a door, black, framed in gold, with a single brass plaque that read, Scene 17, Restricted Access. Miss Marple stepped forward. The door opened without touch. Inside, a stage, but not a theatre, a stage built in miniature, just wide enough for 3 mannequins, each dressed with impeccable detail, each placed in perfect stillness. One was Julian, unmistakable, in his tailored black coat and silver cufflinks. One was Vera, her gown pale grey, her hands positioned in a mid-gesture of farewell. And the third was the girl again, unnamed, unlabeled, her dress plain, her face featureless, smooth porcelain, where features should be, yet the tilt of her head suggested she had seen everything, perhaps even before the others had stepped onto the stage. Miss Marple did not speak, the mannequins did not move, but something else had. The audience, rows of seats, once empty, were now filled, not with guests, not with actors, but with masks, hundreds of them, each seat occupied by a white, faceless mask, identical in every way, mouthless, eyeless, yet somehow observing. She turned to leave. The door behind her was gone. In its place, a mirror, not one hung upon the wall, but one that was the wall, floor to ceiling, edge to edge, and in its reflection, herself, but not as she was, as she had been, then younger, then older, then not at all. Her face aged backward, then forward, then paused at a version of herself she did not recognize, eyes wider, colder, lips slightly parted, as if caught between sentences. The mirror shimmered. The mannequins behind her were no longer mannequins, not visibly changed, no motion, no breath, but they now seemed weighted, as though something within them had taken notice. A line echoed, no voice, just thought, rising like steam from the boards beneath her. Time here isn't linear, it's scripted. The mirror pulsed, once, then returned her reflection, and the stage behind her reset. She stepped backward. The audience did not move, but one mask, front row, center, now bore lipstick, red, fresh, drawn not on lips, but where lips would be. The curtain began to rise, though no strings pulled it. The mannequins turned, slightly. The third one looked at her, and smiled. Chapter 8. The director's cut. The door to the editing room was already open when she arrived, though no one had been seen entering it. No footsteps had echoed along the corridor in the moments before, and yet the scent that met her as she passed through the threshold, something faintly metallic, something that clung not to the nostrils but to memory, announced plainly that someone had been here not long ago and had left something behind that would not be picked up again. Miss Marple moved without pause. The curtains had been drawn hastily. The light that filtered through them was ashen and angular, as if refracted not from the sun, but from a projector mid-flicker, and the screens across the far wall, 8 of them in total, each once assigned to a specific reel, now played nothing, except for the top left monitor, which showed only a frozen frame. Julian Dane, seated, staring into the camera, mouth slightly open, as though caught between the final word of a sentence and the realization that it would never land the way he meant. She did not approach immediately. Instead, she walked around the central editing desk, where film reels had been unspooled, like lengths of silk cut too hastily from a bolt. One lay across the floor, still looped at its core, but stretching outward in a crimson arc. Not red celluloid, not dyed acetate, but blood. There was no sign of struggle, only stillness, and a silver editing razor resting in the exact center of a roll marked S17, Final Composite. Julian sat behind the desk, unmoving. His expression did not suggest pain, it suggested release, not of burden, perhaps, but of resistance. And beside him, a small recording device, black and square, bearing the inscription Ferglan Studio, Master Narrative, Private Only. She pressed play. At first, only static, then breathing, then his voice, hoarse, frayed, and somehow childlike in its cadence. If you're hearing this, it means I've stopped trying to fix what was never mine to control. I always thought directing meant sculpting truth from chaos, shaping a mess into meaning, but I see now that meaning doesn't come from the script, it comes from who survives the end of it. Eloise wasn't supposed to be in the frame. That's what they told me. That's what Vera insisted. She said the audience wouldn't understand her. She said a third voice muddied the harmony. But she was wrong. Eloise knew. From the beginning. She knew the cues before we called them, mouthed the lines before they were written, saw the beats before we rehearsed them. She didn't belong in the cast, because she was the one writing it. We didn't cut her out of the final scene. We cut her out of every scene, every photo, every tape, every reel, erased. I used the razor myself. The tape crackled. A moment of silence passed, not blank, but full, like a breath being held behind glass. But even in silence, she stayed, not as a shadow, not as a ghost, something else. The story didn't collapse when we removed her. It reshaped, around her absence. We thought we were free. We were mistaken. A soft click, then nothing. Miss Marple looked down at the reel. The blood had dried unevenly, caught between the sprocket holes like a forgotten subtitle. The edges of the editing table were clean, too clean, wiped, polished, sanitized, not by cloth, but by memory itself, as though someone had tried to ensure what happened here would blur over time. But memory, she had learned, was a medium not so easily scrubbed. She gathered the reel, threaded it manually. The projector began to whir, low and persistent, like a machine reluctant to resurrect what it had been built to forget. The footage flickered, black screen, then white, then static, then a girl. Not Eloise, not exactly. A shadow of her, a resemblance. A presence, seated in a chair at center frame, her face in profile, unmoving. hair plaited neatly, hands folded in her lap. She was not speaking, but her mouth moved. No sound came through the speaker, only captions, appearing slowly, one word at a time, typed in courier, as if by invisible fingers, still obeying a script long lost. I am not gone. You are. I did not leave. You rewrote me. Now watch how I end it. The screen fractured, the audio spiked, and then, across all 8 monitors, simultaneously, her name, not spelled plainly, but reversed. ESIOLEE, each letter burned in white over the black screen, one per frame, then fading out slowly, replaced by the phrase, Eloise is one, not just the first, the only. The narrative had not simply hidden her, it had become her. The reels began to unspool, not mechanically, but by themselves, ribboning off the tables and across the floor like veins reaching back towards something that had once been whole. Miss Marple stood in silence. The footage did not stop. It glitched, looped, paused, reversed, then resumed, each time showing her less of what she had seen and more of what she hadn't. Vera's smile, off cue, Julian's hand shaking before a line, Eloise's figure, reflected in mirrors no one had filmed. She turned off the projector, the room fell silent. The editing blade was no longer on the table, it now rested beside the tape recorder, clean, waiting. She took the recording device and left the room. The hallway had shortened, the doors had realigned. The layout of the house now mimicked the stage design from the forgotten production file, and down the hall, from a speaker she hadn't noticed before, a voice whispered through static, "The ending isn't real until you speak it." Miss Marple wrote nothing that night. She simply drew one thing, a script page, blank, but at the bottom, one line typed, center aligned. She didn't die, she disappeared into the script. Chapter 9. The Applause Code. It began with a sound, not abrupt, not sharp, but deliberate. 2 claps, spaced apart by silence, then 3 faster, then a pause, then 1, barely audible through the east-facing hallway, where the acoustics didn't so much echo as absorb, where even footsteps became uncertain, as if the floor had been trained to suppress consequence. Miss Marple stood still beneath the gallery arch, chin slightly tilted, as if listening to a child recite something they weren't meant to remember. The applause was not for her, and yet it waited for her acknowledgement. She did not clap back. Instead, she returned to her room and opened her notebook, now fragile at its edges from use, a little warped from the weight of what it had held, and turned to a blank page. In the upper corner she wrote, 2-3-1, a pattern, yes, but not rhythm for applause alone. It was language, Morse code. She tested the idea gently, translating the sequence with calm logic, space, space, dash, EST, not letters, directions, east, south, tower. She dressed plainly, softly, in grey. The house no longer reacted well to defiance. The east wing had changed again. What once held music rooms and curtain rods now resembled a split corridor, lined with display frames, holding film stills that shimmered as one passed, as if projecting memories rather than preserving them. The clapping began again, as she turned the corner, 2, then 3, then 1, no longer from the hallway, but from behind the walls, as if embedded into the structure itself, like a script read aloud too many times, and finally absorbed by the set. At the end of the corridor, a velvet rope, she stepped past it without hesitation. A room waited, unfamiliar, and yet known, the kind one might find in a director's private suite. Mahogany desk, ink pots still half filled, a filing drawer, labeled active contracts, though the names on its folders were crossed out, scribbled in the margins, not with red pen, but with what appeared to be fingerprints smudged into the shape of rejection. She opened the drawer slowly, expecting paper, but finding only one single sheet. It was a contract, unsigned at the bottom, but signed at the top. The signature read, Eloise Dane. The ink was dark, not fresh, but never faded. Below her name, a single clause had been circled again and again, as though someone had reread it in a panic. This party agrees to appear, uncredited, without protest, under the agreed condition that the third role remains unnamed in all production history. Miss Marple traced the line with her gloved finger. Someone had made her invisible, not by hiding her, but by turning her into silence. The applause returned, this time from the ceiling. The clapping stopped, but the message continued. Dot, dash, dot, dot, dash, T.O. She turned toward the southern stairwell, where old wooden steps creaked with the sound of intent rather than age. At the base, a doorway to the record archive, long sealed, now barely cracked open, the light inside flickering, not from the bulb above, but from something closer to flame. She stepped in, a single table in the center, a birth certificate beneath glass, the name, Julian Dane, mother, Eleanor Dane, father, unlisted, a scratch across the middle. Miss Marple leaned closer. Another name had been listed, faint, barely visible now, Vera Dane, typed. Then beside it, in faded script, twin. But the twin's name had been erased, smeared not with ink, but scorched. The paper beneath bubbled slightly from heat. The damage was precise, targeted. She slid her finger beneath the glass. Below the birth certificate, a second sheet, glued beneath, as if hidden. A medical note, one line, handwritten. Subject speaks in future tense, refers to scenes not rehearsed. Claims story is not over. Removal advised. And beneath that, typed, this note shall remain sealed, unless the script repeats. There was no official signature, only an initial they. The clapping started again, but now, it was faster, messier, uncalculated, as though the house itself had become nervous, rushing the cue to stop her from opening the next drawer. She did not stop. In the drawer, a photo, 3 girls, not actors, not posed, children, Vera, smiling too wide, Julian, almost out of frame, eyes down, and the third, the one in the middle, her face gone, burned away, the paper around her intact, her hands still visible, her dress still marked with the faint stain of paint, or ink, or stage chalk, but her face, charred out of history. Miss Marple turned it over. On the back, a single line, Scene 1. If the audience can't see her, she doesn't exist. She walked back into the hall. This time, the applause did not follow her. It retreated, slowly, like someone realizing they'd been caught clapping for the wrong ending. She stopped at the top of the central staircase, and looked down across the ballroom below. The mirrors on the opposite wall had changed again. Her reflection was no longer her own. It was her, but paused, mid-blink, and the expression, recognition, or regret. A door opened behind her. No wind, no creak, just a presence stepping into frame. But she did not turn. She simply said, they didn't kill her with a knife. They erased her with silence. And somewhere behind the mirrors, someone began clapping again, one beat at a time. But now, it was waiting for her to respond. Dali. Chapter 10. Scene 18. Rewrite history. It began, not with thunder or shadow, but with a shift too subtle for the eye to catch. At first, only a chair that no longer faced the same direction it had the day before, a hallway that now curved left instead of ending at the garden stairs, a door that opened onto a wall of red velvet, where yesterday it led to the drawing room, small inconsistencies, like missed cues, on a stage that had once rehearsed perfection, and yet by morning, Fairglen no longer resembled a house, or even a home. It had become a living set, a framework of memory, rearranged by a script that seemed to write itself as each moment passed. Miss Marple noticed first, in the east corridor, the landscape painting of the lake had changed. Same frame, same angle, but the water no longer reflected the distant hills. Instead, it mirrored something behind her, something that was not in the room, something that should not have been able to move unless it had been watching her from the other side of the canvas. And when she turned to look, there was nothing, only the slow creak of the floorboard beneath her shoes, and the quiet hum of the chandelier, adjusting itself, in rhythm with the flicker of the lights overhead. The ballroom was narrower than before, the ceilings, higher, and the guests, those who remained, had begun to avoid their own reflections, not out of vanity, but caution, because somewhere between breakfast and dusk, the mirrors had changed their function. They no longer reflected the present, but played rehearsals from scenes that had not yet happened. The screen in the conservatory displayed a script, projected in silent scroll, white text on black, line after line typed in courier, each section labeled, not by title, but by number. Scene 15, Scene 16, Scene 17, still, Scene 18, new, Scene 19, missing, Scene 20, labeled, the final witness, and below it, the name, Marple, Miss Marple, typed, centered, fixed. She studied it, with neither fear nor surprise, only the still calm of someone who had once watched a lie crumble in slow motion, and knew the pace well enough to remain patient as it collapsed. The script scrolled forward. Each guest's name appeared, each assigned to a scene, and each scene ended not in ellipses or fade-outs, but in parentheses, exit confirmed. No one had written this, not recently, and yet, the ink was still drying. She turned to the mirror beside the piano. It had once been etched with vines, now, stage directions, scrawled in chalk-like handwriting, let her speak. It was written again on the kitchen window, the corridor mirror, the polished surface of the stairwell banister. Every reflection now bore it, let her speak, and beneath it, one word, Eloise. The estate had begun to rewrite itself, not metaphorically, but physically. Doors opened onto rooms that contradicted physics, bedrooms that now mirrored one another in impossible symmetry, closets that stretched deeper than the structure should allow, staircases that looped in disjointed geometry, creating an impression, not of madness, but of forced redirection, like an actor pushed backstage when they've missed their cue, only to discover the hallway behind them has already changed to match the next scene. One guest tried to leave. They walked through the foyer, turned the latch, found themselves in the ballroom again. A circle, not a loop, a rehearsal. Miss Marple returned to her notebook, now strangely lighter, though no pages had been removed. Inside, the text had changed again. The margins now bore corrections in someone else's hand, word substitutions, alternate phrases, scene reassignments, and at the bottom of one page, Marple, Scene 20, confession pending. She looked up. The walls breathed, not with life, but memory. Behind the bookshelf, where no shelf had ever been, a door waited, new, but aged, like a forgotten prop, brought back too late in the production, but needed for closure. Inside, the archive room, not as she had seen it, but as it should have been. Rows of file boxes relabeled, deleted scenes, unaired truths, rehearsals that failed. She opened one. Inside, a reel of footage, marked a seat, forced voice omitted. The tape had been cut, literally sliced, spliced, resealed, but not well. Someone had tried to remove a character, but not their influence. She played it on the nearest viewer. The screen lit. Eloise appeared, not speaking, mouthing, but this time, clearly, "You made me quiet, not gone." She stepped toward the mirror, beside the projector. The chalk returned. Let her speak. This time, the handwriting was her own. She had not written it, but her hand had. The script now ran on its own. No author credited, but all pages signed at the bottom. Scene 18. Rewrite history. Miss Marple turned the page. Scene 19. Still missing. Scene 20. Unchanged. Her name, her role, her cue, but no line, only silence. Waiting. The silence wasn't empty, it was watching. Chapter 11. The voice that never played. There are some corridors that seem to remember you before you step inside them. Spaces that do not echo, but breathe. Not because they are haunted in any familiar sense, but because they have stored within their walls a sound that has been waiting decades for its release. A sound never permitted to play. A voice silenced, not by force, but by erasure. And as Miss Marple walked deeper into the western wing, long considered closed for good, long thought dismantled, she knew by the air alone that this part of Fairglen had not stayed untouched, but had been preserved in silence, like a forgotten reel, left unmarked in a studio vault. Sealed not with tape, but with the intent to forget. She passed beneath an arch, where cobwebs still clung to unused boom arms, and a peeling sign once labelled Audio B, though the name had been crossed out with a single drag of black paint, as though whoever had done so believed the act of erasing a name could also erase the purpose. And yet something about the way the hallway narrowed, how the air thinned just slightly, how the floor no longer creaked, but instead seemed to hold its breath beneath her weight. All of it told her this space had not truly been abandoned, only rewritten into disuse, and she followed the path without hesitation, knowing the house would yield to her now, because it wanted her to hear what had been buried. The door at the end of the hall was not locked, but hesitant. It opened not with the firm click of welcome, but with a reluctant sigh, revealing the old sound booth in full, its interior lit not by electric bulb, but by the warm flickering pulse of aged equipment that should no longer function, and yet did, glowing like embers from the floor panels, where tape once looped and voices once lived. Except this booth had not recorded voices for decades, not since before the last production, not since before they had chosen whose voices would be heard, and whose would not. The player still sat at the desk, untouched, untouched, and untouched, not because no one remembered it, but because everyone did, and resting on its edge, perfectly centered, not dusty but waiting, sat a single reel in a steel canister, marked with clean white label and black typed letters, unornamented, unambiguous, undeniable. Her first line, no year, no name, no cue, only that. And Miss Marple did not ask whose it was. She already knew. She placed the reel on the player, with the care of someone laying a flower on a forgotten grave, her gloved hands moving not with uncertainty, but with respect. And when she pressed play, the machine responded not with resistance, but with a shudder, as though exhaling the first breath it had held, since it was last used to hide a truth in plain sight. First static, then silence, true silence, not the absence of noise, but the presence of restraint, then breath, not dramatic, not staged, just a small breath, shaky, as though taken by someone unsure if she were permitted to continue. Then a voice, a girl's voice, young, trembling, almost whispered, but unmistakably present, not a recording from a film, not a line from a script, but something more elemental, an uncut truth. I was never meant to be famous, just forgotten. Then nothing, not even static, just the soft whir of the tape still spinning. And then, a scream, familiar, sharp, sharp enough to pierce the quiet, sharp enough to come not from a recording but from memory, sharp enough to make the air in the booth retreat slightly from the corners. It was Vera's voice, a sound not intended for audience, a sound that should not have survived the reel. Then the tape cut, snapped, clean. The machine stopped on its own. Miss Marple stepped back, not in fear, but with the certainty that what had just been played was not meant for ears, but for acknowledgement, and that this acknowledgement was the first condition of permission. The lights in the hallway blinked once, then again, not with power failure, but with rhythm. As she stepped out of the booth, she noticed it immediately, the shift. The air was warmer, the carpet slightly indented, and the corridor cameras had turned on, not blinking, not whirring, not panning, just on. The little red lights beneath their lenses were aglow now, each facing a direction where nothing moved, each capturing footage no one had ordered, no one had cued, no one had scheduled. The mirrors in the adjacent studio had begun showing images again, not reflections, not echoes, but recordings, moments from the week before, but reversed, distorted, as though something inside the reel had leaked into the walls. And on every screen that flickered in each hallway, from the ballroom vestibule to the green room hallway, one phrase began to appear, not typed, not overlaid, but embedded in the video grain itself. She has spoken. Miss Marple walked back through the central hall, where the piano no longer played by key but by pattern, its lid open, strings humming faintly, as if remembering a melody once forbidden. The walls now glistened slightly, not with water, not with age, but with the kind of shimmer one sees on old acetate film, when light moves across it, as if the building itself had become a recording surface. And as she turned the corner into the foyer, every camera in the house clicked at once, a sound less like machinery, and more like a throat clearing in anticipation. A screen embedded above the stairs, once decorative, now flickered on. The footage it played was short. It showed the booth, her entering, playing the reel, the girl's voice, then the scream, then static. But over the static, faintly, a second whisper layered beneath, "I never left. You left me out." The hallway mirror bore new writing now, scratched not in chalk, not in dust, but in the smear of something darker. "She was the line before yours," and below it, "Scene 20. Awaiting rewrite." She turned back to the booth. The reel was gone, replaced with an open notebook, not hers, but familiar. The pages were blank, except for the first 3 words, centered, "Let them hear." The silence wasn't empty. It was watching, and now, it had begun recording. Chapter 12. Eloise's script. There is a particular stillness that only occurs in the space between comprehension and confrontation, a moment where understanding has not yet caught up with implication, where the mind recognizes the shape of a truth, but refuses to name it aloud, as though to articulate it would grant it power. And so it was that Miss Marple, now seated alone in what had once been the formal dining room, and was now little more than a repurposed archive of the unreal, turned the brittle pages of a child's handwritten manuscript, and felt not fear, nor even surprise, but something much quieter, recognition, not of authorship, but of intent. The play was called The Murder of Two Prime Celebrity, its title underlined 3 times on the tattered cover in red crayon, the edges dog-eared, the ink faded in places where time had touched it too often. It was written in a looping hand, large and deliberate, the way children write, when they believe no one will ever read what they've written, except themselves. And yet what unfolded across those fragile, uneven pages was no play in the imaginative, improvisational sense. It was a blueprint, meticulously scripted, and impossibly precise, not only in the descriptions of scenes and camera movements, but in the events that had, until now, passed themselves off as present. Each act matched a moment, each line, a revelation already lived. Scene 5, Vera singing, her reflection lagging behind. Scene 9, a guest vanishes, leaving only a coded message. Scene 14, the editing suite, sealed from within. Even Julian's final monologue, the one Miss Marple had found on tape, was printed here, word for word, as though his confession had not been inspired by guilt, but rehearsed in accordance with a long-forgotten script. And it was here, in the middle of Act 3, that the script darkened, not in tone, but in authorship, the ink changing color, the handwriting narrowing, sharpening, as though a second hand had taken over the draft without notice. And beneath the crossed-out scene titles were new ones, written in smaller text, less performative, more personal. Scene 18, Rewrite History. Scene 19, She is Still Here. Scene 20, The Final Witness. Miss Marple turned the page slowly. There were no characters listed beyond that point, only stage directions. All guests return to their cues. 1 exits, 2 remain, 1 forgotten, and then on the final page, written in lighter pencil, as if to disappear over time, a single question underlined twice. Who's writing now? She closed the script. The pages sighed. Across the table, a wall-mounted screen flickered to life, unprompted, as it had before, grainy footage playing in monochrome, static lining the edges, except this time, the footage did not replay the past. It was new. It was her, reading the script, being watched, not by the camera, by the room. She looked up. A mirror once used for performance direction now bore new writing, faint and fogged across its surface, like breath left behind from someone speaking too close. She wrote the beginning, but this isn't hers anymore. The lights dimmed, not simultaneously, but in sequence, as though following an invisible cue. First the chandelier above, then the wall sconces, then the table lamp at her elbow, all reducing until the room felt less like a place and more like a memory of one, the kind that folds in on itself when replayed too often. The projector in the lounge began humming. A reel loaded. No one touched it. Scene 1 played. Black screen, white text, The story begins, then scene 5, then scene 9, each matching her notes, each matching the manuscript, then scene 14, Julian, on screen. But as the sequence progressed, the reel began to shift, to flicker, not because it was old, but because it was wrong, as if the footage no longer agreed with what had been written, as though the celluloid itself had decided the script was outdated and must now evolve. And as the screen jumped again, the title changed. Scene 17, locked. Scene 18, playing. Then scene 19, no description, no actors, no ending, just the title. Rehearsal redacted. Miss Marple rose from her seat and returned to the corridor, where the mirrors had changed again, not in content, but in tone. Her reflection no longer moved in sync. It paused, then blinked. Once, only once, then followed. Every camera turned toward her, not panning, not adjusting, but tilting ever so slightly, as though the house were not recording anymore, but listening. And then from behind the curtain in the far drawing room, a sound emerged, not a footstep, not a whisper, but the unmistakable flutter of pages turning. Not script pages, but notes, dozens of them, pinned across the wall, each marked with a scene number, each revised, the handwriting now unfamiliar, not Eloise's, not Julian's, not Vera's, someone else. Act IV. Inserted. Scene 21. Untitled. Scene 22. Post-curtain. And beneath them, written in a hand Miss Marple had not yet seen. She may have written it, but someone else opened the curtain. The play was no longer obeying its author, and neither were the actors. Somewhere in the house, new dialogue was being spoken, unwritten, unprompted. Miss Marple stood very still, notebook in hand, and asked aloud, though no one stood near, if she isn't writing any more, who is? The silence didn't answer. It didn't need to. It was already working on the final scene. Chapter 13. The deadline scene. There are moments that arrive without ceremony, yet signal the final curtain in ways the soul recognizes before the mind is willing to admit. Moments that stretch not because of time, but because time itself becomes complicit in delaying a truth that has waited long enough. And so it was that Miss Marple, who had never feared silence, but knew its texture better than most, stood before the final door on the third-floor landing, a door that had always remained ajar, but never open. A door not guarded by locks or keys, but by implication, by the unspoken understanding that some scenes were not rehearsed. They were hidden. The room beyond had once been Vera's, so everyone had said, but Vera had not truly lived here, not recently, not completely, because the scent inside was not perfume, but stage dust, not presence but persistence, a clinging atmosphere that felt more like backstage than bedroom. And as Miss Marple stepped through, she saw immediately what others had ignored. Every object carefully placed, every magazine angled just imperfectly enough to suggest spontaneity, every window half open, as though capturing light naturally, and yet it was all too precise, too curated, like a life staged for a camera that never blinked. And at the center of it all, sitting before the vanity, where Vera had once been photographed dozens of times, but never filmed, was the woman. She looked up. Her eyes did not widen. She had been waiting. She looked like Vera, almost, but only in the way that an understudy knows her lines, in the way a reflection mimics rather than lives. And her smile, though poised, did not belong to someone caught off guard, but to someone who has just reached the page of the script she's always known would come. Miss Marple did not sit. She stepped forward. The woman met her gaze and said nothing, because the line was not hers to deliver first. The mirror caught them both, but the light betrayed the fiction. Miss Marple's reflection matched her movements, but the woman's did not. It hesitated, as though unsure of which performance to follow. "You aren't Vera," Miss Marple said, not accusing, not questioning, simply acknowledging. The woman exhaled, not sighing, but releasing, as though a tension long rehearsed had been given permission to end. "She died 3 years ago," Miss Marple continued. "Didn't she?" The woman nodded once. No denial, only relief. There was no trembling, only quiet. "She left you everything," Miss Marple added, "except her name." A pause. Then the woman spoke, not loudly, not emotionally, but with the clarity of someone finally allowed to deliver a line meant for someone else. "She promised me I'd be seen," the woman said. "She said if I took her name, the cameras would finally notice me." "And they did," Marple replied, "but not for her." The woman looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of a compact that had never been used, a prop rather than a possession. "She told me to wear her face, speak her lines, rehearse her version of the ending, but the script wasn't meant to make her eternal. It was meant to erase her." Marple stepped closer. "Erase who?" The woman looked up, her voice barely a breath. "Aluz." The name hung in the air like dust, disturbed by a stage light. Not new, not fresh, but remembered. "She wrote it all," the woman said. "Every word, every scene. She gave us our beginning, but she wrote our ending too." "Why?" Marple asked. "Because we forgot her before we even left the stage," the woman said. "We cut her out. She didn't write herself back in for revenge. She just wanted to be heard." "And the code?" Marple asked. "It wasn't for resurrection," the woman answered. "It was for silence. She didn't want to be remembered. She wanted to take the spotlight with her." Marple turned to the mirror. The room had dimmed, the cameras had turned. Every screen in the house now showed the same image. This room, this woman, this moment. But in the corner of each frame, barely visible, stood a shadow. Not in the room, on the ceiling, high above, cast where no light should reach, watching, not present in flesh, but directing, remembering. The woman's voice broke slightly. "I thought I was becoming her," she said, "but I was only replacing myself." Marple nodded, not in judgment, but in understanding, because this had never been about vengeance. It had been about authorship, and somewhere, someone else was holding the pen again. Chapter 14. The curtain rises again. It is a rare thing for a performance to resume, after the audience has already risen from their seats. Rarer still for the curtain to lift, when all believed the final line had been spoken. Rarer even that the actors themselves do not know they have returned to the stage. And yet, as Miss Marple descended the curved staircase that once framed the great hall of Fairdlan like a ceremonial gesture, something in the light had changed, not brighter, not dimmer, but sharpened, as though the atmosphere itself had been edited to draw focus, to trim away what had no more part to play, leaving only what was essential, the unfinished, the unspoken, and the unwanted truths that had never been cut from the story, but merely buried beneath better ones. The house was no longer hiding, it was preparing, and the air that pressed gently against the windows did not suggest wind or pressure, but anticipation, the kind one feels just before the music begins again, after too long a pause. And though no one had spoken aloud, the name of the play since she first read it in Eloise's childlike handwriting, it now appeared, quietly and with confidence, on every surface she passed, embossed faintly into the velvet of the curtains, etched along the wooden banisters, typed letter by letter into the corner of the black and white monitors in every hall and viewing room. The murder of two prime celebrity, not a headline, not a theory, not even a metaphor, but a title restored to its rightful position in the house that had always been more theatre than home. Miss Marple did not look over her shoulder. She did not need to. The mirrors were already doing it for her. They followed at angles now, not simply reflecting her steps, but pausing just long enough to catch what stood behind her as she passed, as though the reflections themselves were reluctant to show what the eyes would rather not name. The cameras no longer recorded, they framed. Each lens remained still, not swiveling, not scanning, but focused, waiting not for motion, but meaning, for the next word, the next beat, the next decision that might reveal whether this ending was still Eloise's, or if someone else had begun writing again. In the grand foyer, the velvet curtain that once divided the rehearsal wing from the projection hall now fluttered of its own accord, not as a gesture of wind, but of suggestion, and when she approached, it parted, not swept aside by machinery, nor pulled by hand, but by the weight of her presence, as though the space had long ago decided this final movement could not begin until she entered. And behind it, the stage, built into the architecture of the house itself, a proscenium that had not been visible until now, wooden steps rising, red drapes drawn, chairs arranged for no audience, and on the stage, one single spotlight, no actor, no figure, just an open book placed center. Miss Marple stepped forward. She did not hesitate, not because she was fearless, but because she knew that hesitation is what stories feed on, and the time for prolonging silence had passed. The book was not a journal, nor a script, nor even a diary. It was a ledger, each page dated, each date paired with a scene title, and each scene title followed by a name: Julian, Vera, the guests, the stand-in, and then Marple. Scene 20, the final witness. Scene 21, the curtain rises again. Scene 22, author unknown. She turned the page. The next line was blank. Beneath it, a pen, still uncapped, not old, not new, used, but not by her. She looked up. The curtain across the back wall drew itself, slow and deliberate, and there on the ceiling was the shadow, not just cast, but attached, not just watching, but lingering. It did not move, it did not reach, it simply remained, its shape, not whole, not sharp, but remembered, the outline of a girl, hair pulled back, head tilted, hands raised, not to perform, but to frame, to direct, to finish. Miss Marple stepped back. The cameras behind her clicked, the monitors adjusted, and the title reappeared, on every screen, every mirror, every surface that could hold it. Now playing, Scene 22, final cut. But beneath it, in handwriting not typed, not projected, not stylized, was a message, written just once, in chalk, faint, smudged, but unmistakable. You left me out, so I rewrote you in. And with that, the house went still. Not quiet, still, because the curtain had not fallen. It had only been waiting for its cue. Chapter 15. Detectives. Who wrote the code? There are exits that feel more like transitions, departures that carry no sense of finality, because the space being left does not release the one who steps through its door, and so it was, on the final morning, if it could still be called morning in a house where time no longer obeyed. Clocks and shadows bent towards script cues, that Miss Marple descended the staircase of Fairglen Estate, not as a guest or as a detective, not even as a witness, but as something else entirely, as someone whose role had not been assigned, but written from the very beginning, then forgotten, then rediscovered, only to be rewritten once again, not by her own hand, but by a presence that never left the wings. The house had gone quiet, not in the natural way a home does when emptied of people, but in the intentional stillness of a theatre between acts, a silence that listens more than it rests, a silence that hums with something unspoken just behind the curtain, a silence that remembers better than any recording ever could. The doors stood unlocked, the velvet drapes hung uncut, the screens had gone black again. The mirrors, however, remained. She passed them one by one. Some still held her reflection, others did not. One, in the corner of the rehearsal wing, reflected the hallway not as it was, but as it had once been, her walking down it for the first time, notebook in hand, looking left before turning right, the movement familiar and immediate, except that this time, when she stepped past it in the present moment, her reflection paused, only for a second, but long enough, because it did not turn with her. It turned back, toward the house, and the lights flickered, just once, as if the reflection were no longer performing, but remembering. She did not return. She could not. Because the script had ended, at least for her, or so she told herself. The front doors, once sealed with legacy and pretension, now hung open at both sides like parted curtains, not offering escape, but allowing exit. And she stepped through the threshold with neither rush nor hesitation, the gravel beneath her shoes crunching like a cue whispered too early from off stage, and she passed through the garden with her eyes steady, her posture tall, the notebook beneath her arm heavier now than when she had brought it in, not with writing, but with watching. Behind her, the house exhaled, and the camera above the entrance turned, slowly, silently, and faced the door. Then the screen cut to black. No credits, no score, just her voice. Alone, soft, but certain. The code wasn't for them. It was for us. You watched it, didn't you? Then silence. Then the sound of clapping. 2 slow, deliberate claps, From nowhere, then nothing, and then text, appearing letter by letter, like a typewriter feeding a final line to an empty stage. Comment below. Did you spot the code word in Chapter 9? Rewatch. And remember, if you clap alone, someone might answer. Pause. Another flicker. One more line. Subscribe for more mysteries. But beware, not every story ends after the credits. And just before the black screen fades out, the final image appears. Not footage, not recording, not even a memory. Just a shadow, faint and high, stretching across the ceiling of an empty room, arms raised not in warning, but in direction, guiding. One last line, whispered without voice. The silence wasn't empty, it was watching,